Hi, welcome. Enjoy the content, subscribe, and turn on notifications.
Colin was the kind of man who believed in the strength of commitment. Married for almost a decade to Rachel, he always prioritized dialogue, respect, and presence. Even with a demanding work routine, he made sure to be present in simple moments: dinner on Wednesday, an improvised breakfast on Sunday, a quiet walk after a tough day. Rachel, for her part, seemed to respond with affection and dedication. They laughed together, made plans, talked about kids, trips, and even about growing old side by side. So when Rachel's professional trips started becoming more frequent, Colin tried to see it as just a more demanding phase of her career. And indeed, she was being increasingly requested, with reports to deliver, meetings in other states, and participation in conferences. At first, he even felt proud. It was good to see his wife advancing in her career, gaining recognition. But some situations began to bother him subtly. It all started with a change in frequency. What used to be a trip every quarter turned into one per month. Then it became bi-weekly. Some weeks, she would leave on Monday and return on Friday, claiming they needed her for important meetings with investors. And there was always one name involved in these trips: Brian. She said Brian was a demanding boss, but that he trusted her a lot. According to Rachel, he often called on her because she was precise, quick, and had good judgment. Colin tried to accept this justification, but over time, he noticed that the tone in which Rachel spoke about her boss had changed. She mentioned Brian at seemingly random moments, praised jokes he made during meetings, the way he organized presentations. At first, it seemed like professional admiration. But Colin began to notice the difference in how she spoke about him compared to other colleagues. Names like Jenna, Peter, or Olivia came up briefly. But Brian always stood out, even on weekends. At the same time, Colin felt Rachel's attention drifting away. She still said she loved him, but she seemed more distant. Sometimes, she would pick up her phone during dinner and smile while reading messages. When he asked, she said it was just someone from work or a group chat with the team. She started staying up later, claiming she needed to review presentations. She spent hours in front of the computer, even after their workday had ended. And when Colin offered help or suggested she finish it the next day, she got irritated or responded sarcastically. One night, he walked into the living room and saw Brian's name flashing on her phone screen. She quickly hid the device and said it was a group message. He believed her, but the doubt lingered. And it kept growing. One episode in particular marked the beginning of this distrust. It was their wedding anniversary. Nothing grand. Just a quiet evening reserved for them to be together, as they always did. Colin prepared a simple dinner, bought wine, and set everything up. Rachel called 2 hours before the scheduled time, saying that Brian had asked her to travel last minute for an event in Chicago. She didn't even stop by home. She went straight from work to the airport. She apologized hurriedly and hung up with a promise to make it up later. Colin ate dinner alone that night. He washed the dishes slowly, observing every movement as if it would help him process the frustration. The food got cold, the wine lost its taste, and he stayed there, motionless, trying to understand what was happening. When Rachel returned from Chicago, she acted naturally. She apologized for missing the anniversary and said she felt terrible for letting the date pass without celebration. As a way to make up for it, she prepared dinner that night, complete with folded napkins and a bottle of Chilean wine that Colin liked. She tried to seem present, made jokes, told some stories from the trip. She mentioned that she had bought some new clothes there. He smiled, thanked her for the effort, but inside, he remained restless. In the following days, he began to observe more carefully. But deep down, something screamed. He knew Rachel. He knew how she reacted when she was excited, when she felt involved, when she was in love. And the woman he observed now seemed to have that glow directed elsewhere. Toward someone. Brian was becoming an increasingly constant presence, even when absent. He was the name that popped up at disconnected moments, the figure that justified delays, changes of plans, unexpected trips. Colin began to realize that his relationship was being eroded not by arguments, but by absence. A silent absence, that slipped through the cracks of each day until it became impossible to ignore. What began as an uncomfortable suspicion turned into certainty when Rachel announced, in a rush, that she had to travel again. She said Brian had requested her presence at a conference in Denver, something important, full of strategic contacts, and that she had to leave the next day. Colin listened, nodded, and kept to himself the growing discomfort with each new excuse. She had barely finished explaining and was already packing clothes, documents, and her laptop. Seeing the suitcase open on the bed, a detail caught his attention. Among the coats, scarves, and dark blazer, she placed a brand new bikini, still with the tag. It was different from the ones she usually wore, more daring. Colin didn't ask anything, just observed. She noticed his look, smirked, and said maybe the hotel had an indoor pool, so she was bringing it just in case. Rachel boarded the flight in the morning, and Colin, after a sleepless night, decided to act. He went through the email history on her old computer, the one she had used before switching machines. He searched for keywords, hotel names, tickets, conferences. After nearly 2 hours of searching, he found a reservation receipt made days earlier. The destination wasn't Denver. It was a resort called Crystal Shores, located over 1,000 miles from the city mentioned. The reservation was under Rachel and Brian's names, for a room with a sea view, a full package including spa, massages. The professional event was a poorly constructed lie. Without hesitation, Colin took the car, filled it with gas, and left. He drove for hours, mentally reviewing everything he had ignored. The laughter on the phone, the absences during important moments, the emotional distance. He arrived at the resort in the late afternoon. He parked far from the main entrance and discreetly walked to the back, where the resort opened onto the beach. There were few people there, some couples enjoying the end of the day. And then he saw it. Rachel was walking with Brian along the shore, hand in hand. Both were barefoot, laughing softly, completely comfortable with each other. Rachel was wearing only the bottom of the bikini, her body pressed against Brian's, as if it was the most natural thing in the world. At no point did they show concern about who might see them. She put her arm around his shoulder, and he pulled her by the waist, with evident intimacy. The complicity between them was undeniable, as if they were living an old romance, the kind that doesn't need explanations. The way she looked at him, how he touched her skin so freely, made it clear that there was no longer any room for pretense. It was the raw confirmation of everything Colin had feared. Colin took out his phone and started recording. He filmed for a few minutes, then moved closer and took several photos with the zoom adjusted. He wanted to make sure nothing was left out. Then, he walked toward the two. Brian was the first to see him and froze. Rachel turned immediately after and stopped smiling. They exchanged quick glances. Rachel tried to say something, perhaps start an explanation, but Colin was direct. He said he knew everything, that he had proof, that there was nothing left to say. Brian stepped back, trying to avoid confrontation. Rachel took a step forward, said his name in a low tone, but Colin simply turned his back and returned to the car. What he needed to see, he saw. What he needed to feel, he felt. And that was enough. Colin got in the car and drove for hours with his eyes fixed on the road and his mind racing. There was no more room for doubt, nor excuses to swallow. That image of Rachel, without the top of the bikini, pressed against her boss on the beach, would stay imprinted like an involuntary tattoo, the kind that burns every time you touch the subject. He didn't cry. He didn't scream. The silence was heavier than any explosion. When he got home, the first thing he did was open the closet and start taking out everything that belonged to her. Every piece of clothing, every perfume, every object that still carried some trace of their story was packed into suitcases. He separated everything with surgical precision, without hesitation. He took the suitcases, brought them to the curb, and left them there. Then he went back, typed a new password into the electronic lock. He stood for a few minutes looking at the living room. It was the same space as always, but it no longer felt like part of his life. He went upstairs to the bedroom, picked up his phone, connected it to the computer, and transferred the videos and photos he had taken. He also gathered the screenshots of old messages, the reservation receipts, the fake itinerary. He opened his email and typed the address of the human resources department of the company where Rachel worked. He wrote a straightforward text, without bitter words, just describing the facts clearly, attaching all the files as evidence. In another email, addressed to Brian's wife, he was more careful. Her name was Melissa. Colin found her on social media, discovered her email through the company domain, and, respectfully, sent everything. He didn't write judgments, just the truth. He ended the message saying that she deserved to know. The night before, after being confronted on the beach, Brian took Rachel back to the hotel in silence. They barely exchanged words during the ride. Upon arrival, he dropped the room key at the reception and said he needed to leave immediately. He was pale, sweating, with wide eyes. He muttered that Colin would certainly tell Melissa, his wife, and that he needed to get home before she found out from someone else. Rachel tried to hold him back, begged him to stay at least that night with her, but Brian was already at the door, calling a taxi on his phone. He left without looking back. Alone, Rachel entered the room with a trembling body. She cried for hours, sitting on the bathroom floor, clutching a towel as if it would prevent the world from collapsing. She called Colin dozens of times, alternating between calls and desperate messages. She wrote everything that crossed her mind, that it had been a mistake, that she felt lost, that she still loved him, that she was willing to fix everything. But he didn't respond. Not a word. No call back. Not even a confirmation of receipt. The next morning, she returned home dragging her feet. Her face was swollen, her makeup smeared from the day before, the same wrinkled outfit. She got out of the car without energy, hoping that perhaps she could still talk to him, look into his eyes, explain. But as soon as she approached the gate, she understood that the decisions had already been made. The suitcases were stacked on the curb, side by side, cold and organized. It was impossible to ignore the message. The pain she felt at that moment surpassed all the humiliation of the previous night. Rachel approached the door with teary eyes. She typed the password into the electronic lock, her fingers trembling. The red light blinked. She tried again, once more, and again. All attempts were denied. The password had been changed. She rang the intercom. Nothing. She waited. She rang again. Silence. No one answered. She sat on the curb next to the suitcases and stayed there for a while, staring at the door. She picked up her phone, opened the last message she had sent, and saw it was still unread. She started writing another one but stopped halfway. There was nothing left to say. Everything that needed to be shown had already been shown. After sitting there for a few minutes, staring at the closed door and the void that had grown between them, Rachel got up silently, dragged the suitcases to the car, and left. She drove straight to her mother's house, without saying a word on the way. She knew that from that point on, everything would be different. In the days that followed, the impact was immediate. The company suspended Rachel and Brian while opening an internal investigation. Colin received a call from HR confirming that the material had been received and that they would take action. Melissa replied to the email with a simple, "Thank you." The short response said more than any rant. She knew. And now she also had to decide what to do with it. Colin, for his part, felt a mix of relief and exhaustion. He no longer had to pretend everything was fine. He no longer carried the burden of doubting the person who shared his bed. For the first time in months, he breathed deeply without feeling like he was betraying his own intuition. The following weekend, Rachel showed up unexpectedly. She looked worn out, her makeup smudged, her eyes red. She knocked on the door for several minutes until Colin opened it. He didn't say anything. He just looked at her, and she started talking as if she needed to justify everything at once. She said it was a mistake, that things had gotten out of control, that Brian was insistent and that she felt valued by him. She tried to turn it into a series of impulsive decisions, an emotional imbalance, an emptiness that made her seek in another place what she no longer found at home. Colin listened to every word without interrupting. When she finished speaking, her eyes red and voice faltering, Colin remained silent for a few seconds. Then he looked at her firmly, without anger, just with the coldness of someone who no longer feels anything. He looked directly into her eyes and said, in a low but cutting voice, "I feel disgusted by you." Then he closed the door slowly, without hurry, as if sealing the end of a chapter. He left her there, alone, outside. It was the beginning of a new life, just his, without masks, without false promises, and with his dignity intact. The repercussions came quickly and left no room for damage control. Days after Colin's report to the company's HR department, Rachel and Brian were called to a meeting with the board and the legal department. At first, they tried to act naturally, as if it were all some kind of misunderstanding. But the documents Colin sent spoke for themselves. There was clear evidence of embezzlement, accommodations paid for with the corporate card, reservations under both their names on dates incompatible with any official meeting. The trips considered strategic were nothing more than disguised vacations. Luxurious dinners, massages, romantic packages sold as professional events. The finance department cross-referenced information and discovered other old expenses that had gone unnoticed until then. Falsified reports, manipulated receipts, and even generic invoices that concealed their personal spending. Based on this data, the company immediately suspended Brian, initiated disciplinary proceedings, and called for an external audit. Rachel tried to appeal to her record as an exemplary employee, but the breach of ethical conduct was undeniable. 2 days later, she was also fired. Both left with ruined reputations and no right to severance. Melissa, Brian's wife, received everything she needed from Colin. The photos, the videos, the screenshots, the timeline of their encounters. She didn't hesitate. As soon as he got home, she kicked him out. And despite all the flimsy excuses he tried to present, Melissa stuck to her decision. That same month, she filed for divorce. Brian moved into a rented apartment and began facing a legal battle not only for the end of the marriage but also due to formal accusations of corporate fraud. As the internal investigation became public, he lost credibility in the market and started receiving legal notices from clients who felt wronged by his actions. Rachel, on the other hand, tried contacting Colin for weeks. She sent long messages, some attempting to justify what she did, others pleading for forgiveness. She said she missed him, that she was sorry, that she had lost everything. She revealed that Brian had disappeared, that she felt used, discarded, and that reality had hit hard. She shared that she was temporarily living with her mother and trying to understand how things had reached that point. Colin read some messages, ignored others. He didn't reply to any. He was focused on rebuilding his own life. He moved cities and decided to start over. He wanted distance from any memories. Weeks passed, and the divorce went through. The silence between them was maintained throughout the process. Rachel signed the papers without contestation. She knew that even if she tried to argue, nothing would change the course of things. The final signature was merely the formal confirmation of what had been sealed since the moment Colin saw the truth with his own eyes. And so, their marriage ended without arguments, without hearings, without goodbyes. Only with the coldness of a stamped document and the certainty that love, when betrayed, falls apart quickly, but dignity remains. Colin went back to running in the mornings, reconnected with old friends, and returned to painting, a hobby he had abandoned in the early years of marriage. He began to see his own worth more clearly. He no longer sought explanations for Rachel's behavior. He understood that betrayal said more about her than about him. What surprised him most was the email he received months later, from Melissa. It was short, direct, and respectful. She thanked him for telling the truth, said she was also rebuilding herself, and hoped he was at peace. Colin replied with few words but sincerely. They said they were happy to have gotten out of those relationships before losing themselves. From then on, they exchanged sporadic messages, without ulterior motives. They were just two survivors of similar stories, recognizing in each other the strength they both needed to move forward. Over time, these conversations became more frequent. They shared stories, confidences, laughs. And when they met in person for the first time, it felt natural. Without pretension, without masks. Just two people who knew exactly what it meant to have their hearts broken and still stand tall. They moved slowly, cautiously, respecting each other's pace. And what started as friendship turned into partnership. A complicity without weight, without the past hanging over their shoulders. Meanwhile, Rachel went from resume to resume, without success. Being fired for unethical conduct stained her reputation in the job market. Her relationship with her mother also became strained. She began living isolated, feeling the weight of the choices she had made. Brian vanished completely. He cut ties with her, with mutual friends, and even with former colleagues. Rachel tried to start over in other ways, but nothing seemed to work. The regret came too late. There was no going back. Colin, on the other hand, lived a light life. He understood that the pain hadn't destroyed him. It simply revealed what needed to change. And he discovered that dignity, when preserved, transforms into peace. He had freed himself. And the most beautiful part was realizing that, even after so much suffering, there was still room to start over, with someone who also recognized the value of truth.
Suspicious of your wife or daughter-in-law? Don't go through what we saw in the video. Check the link in the comments and get the ebook with valuable tips and investigator-approved sites to clear your doubts.
Thank you for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you won't miss any updates. See you next time.